Hello, everybody. Welcome to Lex's Lounge, and I am coming to you after a couple weeks break in this incredibly bright red shirt to talk a little bit about deplatforming and bans and internet censorship as it occurred in the context of the past week. Obviously, this is a topic I know quite a bit about and have a personal stake in. I have obviously been getting banned and deplatformed and shadow banned and struck since way, way, way before it was mainstream. In fact, even as I'm recording this video on my main channel, not this one, I currently have strikes outstanding. So there you go. I know a thing or two about this. So, with that said, let's talk about Trump getting banned from Twitter and what I felt about that part of the situation. Let's talk about the situation with Parler and what Google, Apple, and Amazon did to them. And then let's talk about what individual users can do in order to sort of take back control from big tech companies, because there's certainly a good swath of options for you guys out there. So, first, this whole Trump Twitter ban. So, on one hand, I can totally understand and sympathize with the idea of banning Trump off of Twitter. Trump regularly tweets things and does stuff on Twitter that is a violation of Twitter rules where any other user doing it would be instantly suspended. Now, the reason that Trump has been able to get away with things that other Twitter users cannot for years now is the world leaders policy. And that is effectively a policy that allows world leaders to tweet and say anything without Twitter suspending them, basically because what those world leaders say is newsworthy. And there's all sorts of world leaders who have said things worse than Trump in many respects, genocidal things, dictatorial things, and they're allowed to remain on Twitter despite that. So then Twitter decides that based on the events at the Capitol on January 6th, they were going to take a couple of Trump's most recent tweets, sort of assign some context to them, make some judgments on how those tweets may be perceived by certain people. That in itself is problematic. And then they banned him despite their world leaders policy. I had a lot of problems with this, and I'm not the only one. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who's no fan of Trump, also was not a fan of the fact that a tech CEO and his board can suddenly become judge, jury, and executioner for the opinions of any world leader that they choose in a way that's not even consistent with their own stated rules. So, personally, despite the fact that I think that Trump was using his Twitter in an incredibly irresponsible way, inciting his supporters to riot, inciting his supporters that the election was stolen when, as I've covered on this channel previously, it most certainly was not stolen or rigged or any such thing. I felt that while those things certainly warranted a ban to an ordinary user, they should have stuck consistent to their policies, let Trump stay on Twitter until he was no longer president, and then they could have banned him for beaking off in a way that wasn't allowed, which I'm sure he was going to do in the near term. So that's my 2 cents specifically on the Trump Twitter ban. But then things got a little more interesting. So there is this alternate to Twitter called Parler, which is kind of like Twitter, except the highlight of the service is that there's no moderation of any kind on the service. You can pretty much say anything, and it doesn't matter what it is, they are not going to remove it or ban you or any such thing. So, this is in fact a problematic type of way to run a public platform because there are certain minimum rules that I've always felt were appropriate, such as people making credible threats of violence and assassination that needed to be moderated. And looking around at Parler, it does in fact appear that they don't moderate even that kind of thing. There's long, in depth threads about people planning all sorts of violence all over Parler. So once Donald Trump was deleted, not only his supporters, but a lot of people in the right wing felt that Twitter was overstepping its boundaries and flocked to Parler. Now, this immediately resulted in Parler effectively getting more users in a few days than it ever had going back to its inception, which was only about 3 years ago. And then what happened was very quickly in sequence, first, Google and Apple removed Parler from its app stores. Now, that is within their rights to do. And then Amazon, who provides the server hosting for Parler, decided to cut off its server hosting with very little notice. Now, this third thing may in fact be a contract violation because Amazon is supposed to give 30 days notice when it cuts off hosting to a website. Parler is suing Amazon and they may in fact have a case. However, this does not mean that Parler as a service was not deeply problematic because you cannot do no moderation, period. It's gonna end badly, particularly when there's big users with a big following like Donald Trump who are willing to push the envelope and abuse that. Now, this doesn't mean that the right wing does not have a Twitter-like platform to which it can flock to. As many quickly guessed, Parler was not on its own, and there are alternatives even to it. There's a Twitter alternative and a Parler alternative, I suppose, called Gab, which is still a little bit more hardcore free speech and all that and permissive than Twitter is, but it's not a highlight of Gab's service that there's no moderation on there whatsoever. And Gab has also gained more users in just a couple of days than in the 2 years prior. So there you go. Now, my personal feeling of this whole situation is that regardless of how you view it from a political standpoint, regardless of whether you actually still believe that the election was rigged or not, this has certainly proved that big tech has way, way, way too much power. People need to disengage from it. There's way too much monopolizing. Like the whole thing between Amazon, Google, and Apple and Parler raises antitrust questions as well. However, there's a lot that users can do at this point to decouple themselves from big tech. Let me list you guys a few alternatives. You don't like Google search, you feel that it's biased, you feel that it's censoring something, you feel that it's tracking you. There's an alternative. It's called DuckDuckGo, a private search. It's not as customizable as Google search. However, it's perfectly usable and I use it all the time. Don't like Google Chrome tracking you? That's fine. There's something called Brave Browser that I've discussed in this channel before, and I'll link in the video description to the episode where I talked about it. And the great thing about Brave is that it has a whole other business model that revolves around not tracking what you do online and in fact gives you privacy. But those aren't all your options. For email, you don't have to use Gmail or Yahoo Mail or any one of these other things that at the end of the day, the company can just come in and look at all your emails or whatever. You can use something like Proton Mail, which is end-to-end, totally encrypted communication via email. And even when it comes to decoupling yourself from something like Facebook and Facebook Messenger, you have options. For example, there are apps like Signal and Telegram. Signal is one that I use myself and is endorsed by both Elon Musk and Edward Snowden. And much like the Proton Mail, it's end-to-end encrypted communications except via SMS text messaging. You use it on your phone. And the other cool thing about Signal is that if both people have it, it also adds a sort of video chat function that's also encrypted, effectively cutting out one of the big features that's unique to Facebook Messenger. And of course, you can even decouple yourself from YouTube nowadays. There are several YouTube alternatives that are rising up in the charts. One of those alternatives is BitChute, where I upload all my content. You might be watching it on there right now. One of them is the WeedTube, which is like more of a cannabis-friendly one. There's also other YouTube alternatives that sort of run on decentralization and crypto. So, really, no shortage of options for you guys if you feel that big tech is throwing their weight around more than they should be, which they are. So there you go, everybody. There's my 2 cents for you, real quick. Hopefully, I've given you something to think about and some new apps to explore. On that note, if you found this useful, make sure you're subscribed, that you've hit that like button, and we'll see you all next time.